Cool. I think we're live, Kirsty.
Right. Okay then. So we're just waiting for a few more attendees to join us, and then we will make a start.
Cool. How many people did you have registered, Kirsty?
There was over 100 people registered. So
Okay,
we've
wow.
got around 50 have joined us, and we will just wait for the rest.
Cool. Well, we picked the perfect weather to be indoors watching or listening to a webinar, haven't we?
Exactly. I must say, I'm pleased we're not trudging people out to a field.
Yeah. No, I think that's definitely put the correct way around to do it this time. Yeah, the weather's here to stay, I think, till next week, isn't it?
I think so. Storm Alex.
Yeah. And you were saying, Sarah, that the conditions in the fields where the cattle are just starting to get a bit wet on top now.
Yeah, so be keeping an eye on them over the next couple of days, and then making some decisions in terms of stocking rate and on time if they start to make a bit of a mess. But it's held up really well so far for this year.
Oh, it's been a wonderful September. Yeah, so far it's put quite a bit of grass ahead of most people. It's just, could get a bit tricky and challenging in the next few days. But at least we started with dry soil, and it's going to take a little bit of water before it gets mucked up.
Yeah.
Okay.
It can change rather quickly though.
I think we'll make a start. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kirsty Tick, and I'm the Project Manager for Agri-Tech Cornwall at Rothamsted Research. Thank you for joining this webinar with James Daniel, a grazing management specialist working with farmers across the country, and Dr. Sarah Morgan from the world-renowned Agricultural Research Institute, Rothamsted Research. These leaders in their field will be debating rotational grazing and what difference it makes to your land, pocket, customers, and the environment. This research is supported by Agri-Tech Cornwall, which is a 4-year initiative to increase research and development in Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly, and part funded by the European Regional Development Fund. The project is led by Duchy College and the Rural Business School, and in partnership with leading research institutes, the University of Exeter and Plymouth, Rothamsted Research, as well as the Cornwall Development Company. We'll be having a Q&A session at the end of this webinar, so please enter your questions in the Q&A function, and we will try to get to as many of them as possible. We'll also produce a Q&A document after the event for the delegates so that we can answer all queries that were posted. We're really interested to find out what sector our delegates are representing today. So we will now put up a poll, which we would kindly ask you to complete.
So hopefully that was an easy question, Kirsty, to get them started.
Exactly. I hope so anyway. So I think we're probably about there on everybody responding. So thank you very much. So now I'd like to hand over to James Daniels from Precision Grazing for our first presentation.
Cool, thank you, Kirsty. So I was getting myself sorted with which screen I'm going to share with you guys. There we go, and let's just see what we do here. Do that. Cool, we'll get this one fired up. Okay, so if that's worked for everyone, and perhaps Sarah or Kirsty, you could just give me a yes or no. Should be sharing the first slide of the presentation with you now.
Yes, it's all fine. Okay,
great, thanks for that. So yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, thanks for taking the time out your day to come and listen to this webinar. Weather's pretty rough outside, so this is perhaps the the best place you can be for the next hour or so. I'm going to set the scene for you guys as to how this project came about, and in doing so, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my background and why myself and Precision Grazing are involved with this project. We'll start with Precision Grazing. So we're a farm consultancy business. I've got two colleagues, Rhys and Sarah. Rhys based in Wales and Sarah in Shropshire. And we're working with livestock farmers, so beef, sheep and dairy, to help them adopt pasture-based methods of production, which enables them to reduce their inputs and reduce cost, become more profitable and resilient. And with that, enjoy the farming, enjoy their business for the benefit of themselves, their community, and the environment. Key to our work, or a really large part of our work, is working with Farming Connect, and for them we deliver things like the Pasture project or Prosper from Pasture project, as well as the Welsh Pasture project, which is a pasture measurement project. So most of our activity is around making better and best use of pasture, whether that's grass or whether that's herbal lays. And we do that right across the UK, mainly in England and Wales. So how did Precision Grazing start or come about? Well, for myself, I'm from a family farm in Cornwall. It was a sheep and beef farm, and then we went to all sheep when I went away to study engineering at Harper Adams. So whilst I was away at Harper Adams, and when I left Harper Adams and went to work for a engineering company, I was always coming back on the weekend to farm, and so we were all sheep at that time, doing a pretty good job sheep-wise, very productive, prolific flock. But as I decided I wanted to come home to the farm full-time, we looked at our business and sort of thought, well, farm's not really big enough for two families, so if I'm going to come back, where and how am I going to add the value? And we looked at our system, although we had the sort of breeding and nutrition and animal health side of things, sort of we felt in hand. We were achieving really good sort of metrics, really good KPIs for those parts of the business. We didn't know much about grazing management, and we'd sort of fluctuate on the farm from loads of grass to no grass. And when we had loads of grass, we'd make lots of bales that we didn't need. And when we had no grass, we'd spread fertilizer, and then we'd all of a sudden have lots of grass. So that was a bit frustrating. So in 2015, I went out to New Zealand, and through the kind contacts of a really good friend, I wound up on a very different sort of farm. So I wound up in the Manawatu, which is sort of middle to bottom of the North Island, near the town of Bulls, on a farm called Burley, managing the property for the Weirs, for Harry and Chloe Weir. And that property was really quite interesting. It had 1,100 head of cattle on about 430 acres effective. So it was highly stocked. Half of those cattle were bulls, Frisian bulls. So they were the male calves from the New Zealand dairy industry. They were kept as bulls, and they were taken through the finish on grass alone. And then the other half of the animals were dairy cross beef, steers and heifers. And again, they were taken through the finish on grass alone. And what was quite unique about the property was that it was all set up in techno-grazing systems. And so we'll come on to those very shortly as to what that means. But what it basically means was that the animals on the farm were run in reasonably small groups, because that's how you stop your bulls fighting when they get over 12 months old. And all of the groups on the farm moved to a new paddock or to new pasture every 2 days, roughly speaking. So every day in the morning, first part of the day would be to go and move the groups that were due for a shift that day. And so on a normal morning, that would involve me moving sort of 25 to the 35 groups of stock. And what made that particularly interesting was that we used electric fencing across the whole farm. There was almost no permanent fences, and all of the water system was mobile, so it moved with the stock. It was interesting what I saw on that farm. It was very different to what we were doing at home. And what I couldn't quite get my head around at the time was how much grass that farm could grow, even though it was practically organic. So never used any nitrogen fertilizer, just used a little bit of compound and I spread a little bit of lime. So the stocking rate and the output it was achieving, you almost couldn't believe. I couldn't believe how quickly grass would grow. without fertiliser being used. So it was quite a good wake-up call, and when I came back, I thought, well, this is some really good stuff I'd seen. How can we apply this to what we do at home? So just as an overview, and we'll cover this in more detail in Sarah's presentation, but this is what we refer to, what we mean, we refer to a techno-grazing system. So a techno-grazing system was invented by the owners of the property, by Harry and Chloe Weir, and it was a method of grazing large numbers of animals. They're operating in small groups, so this was really important in New Zealand for the bull beef sector. Bull beef was a really good business to be in. The cows were cheap to buy, but the carcass value was pretty decent, and bulls are really efficient converters of pasture. However, bulls, Frisian bulls in particular, when they get over 12 months old, like to fight each other. So the idea was to divide and conquer, to split them into groups of 25 to 30, but then that meant you had lots of groups. So where a techno came in is it put in the infrastructure, so this lane-based system, to run lots of groups side by side, but to be able to shift them and to water them as if they were one big group. So you can see in the picture in the foreground, we've got a couple of groups of cattle there. There's actually Frisian bull calves, and there's some dairy cross beef steers and heifers to the side of them. And behind those animals is a temporary electric fence. And then keeping those groups apart is a sort of permanent electric fence. And the posts that are used to make up that permanent electric fence are put in using GPS, and they're spaced equally. So if you were to offer one post, as you can see in the diagram there with those dotted lines, that area that's encompassed, that's enclosed within those dotted lines, is the same anywhere in the system. So when you build one of these systems, when you sort of mark it out on the ground, it means that anyone can very, very quickly become an expert in pasture allocation. You know that the lane the animals are in has 60 posts. And if you allocate 2 posts a day, that's a 30-day rotation. And so much of grazing management is managing the pasture cover, and that's done through the correct rest period, or we might refer to it as the correct rotation length. So allocating the right amount of pasture and be able to adapt how much you allocate per day to suit the growth rate of the pasture is really important. And that's what a techno, it's very easy to do that in a techno system. And the skill of being a manager on that place was to decide what rotation length you should be at for a given time of the year. But it was relatively easy to read because of the pattern of regrowth that you could see behind you. So there's a lot of clarity managing those systems. Obviously, the scale of landscape and the stock class we were dealing with was a bit unique. So when I came back home in 2016, I took what we could from that experience and put it to use both in home as we moved to we set up an outdoor lambing flock and introduced a lot of subdivision on the farm, but then also with my neighbours. And with support from HDB in 2016, we launched a project with 3 neighbours, and 2 of those had cattle, 1 of those had sheep. So we set up 2 very small techno-grazing trial plots, if you like, and we ran a group of cattle through those, and in the field next door, we had a group of cattle that was set stocked. So you can see there's a picture of a couple of the fields we used. And you see how one was divided into cells or into paddocks, 16 in total, with 1 group of cattle. And the other part of that group were held in the field next door, and they were just set stocked and managed as per the farmer's sort of usual practice. And it's really interesting because in doing that trial, it took me on a bit of a journey of what my neighbours required in terms of information and assistance for them to adopt this style of grazing management. And at the start, there was a lot of sort of hand holding, not obviously not physically, but a lot of mental sort of hand holding. And we had lots of obstacles and barriers to overcome in terms of how often to move the animals, training the stock with electric, sorting out the water system, getting the infrastructure set up. But it was awesome to see that within 2 or 3 weeks of them operating that system for themselves, how in tune with the pasture they became, and how quickly stock adapted to that system. So at the end of 2016, we had some results. So this is results from one of the farms. So the field was relatively small, it was 12 acres. In theory, we could split that into 64 cells when we needed to, but really for the season, it ran as a 16 paddock system where the animals moved around every 2 days. We had a mixture of dairy cross heifers and steers from a variety of sources with a range of breeds. And we held them at a pretty high stocking rate, sort of 5.5 head a hectare. Because these animals were growing, we were sort of rotating the animals in and out of the system. So when they were over 500 kilos, they went through into the finishing unit, and then we brought in some lighter animals. So the average number of days an animal spent in that system was 154. The average day live weight gain was reasonably low, but the total live weight gained from in that field was high. So in that field, we achieved just over 1,000 kilos of live weight a hectare. When we compared that to the HDB sort of stock take figures, so the sort of average figures for the UK, we actually produced double the live weight per hectare compared to a similar system or a comparative system compared to our field that had been set stocked next door. So that was pretty cool because that was the same pasture, the same cattle, the same fertilizer policy and the same farmer, but all of a sudden we doubled the output with some infrastructure and some management. And if there's anything that's going to get a farm through the sort of forthcoming challenges with Brexit and the reduction in farm subsidy and the environmental pressures, then doubling production with no increase in inputs looks like a pretty good way to start. So that was 2016. That was actually, for a fledgling farm consultancy business, that was a pretty good start and some really good information to have. Looking out to the wider picture, we had DEFRA on the back of Brexit with Andrea Leadsom, who was MP at the time in 2017 at the Oxford Farming Conference, coming out with a statement that DEFRA's ambitions for the UK were first to produce more and to sell more and export more, but then second to leave the environment in a better state than we found it. So, thinking back to what we learned in 2016 as a business and what I'd seen in New Zealand, this is great. Yeah, we can definitely do that. We can produce more. Well, but the second part of the environment, well, lots of anecdotal evidence, but maybe a bit of a question mark on what physical evidence we had for the environmental benefits of what we were doing. Again, speaking of Brexit, 2016, 70% of livestock producers relied on their single farm payment to generate a profit. So that need to increase output sort of fitted, and increase output, reduce costs, fitted with the awareness that farm business income is going to come under pressure. There's quite a bit of evidence in the industry that adopting managed grazing systems like techno-grazing, like rotational grazing, could provide a financial benefit. And what we sort of started to see was some food processing and retail companies offering incentives or initiatives for producers to adopt rotational managed grazing. So we had AVP with that Alpha Lamb scheme, and there was a bonus per kilo carcass if the farmer was rotational grazing or had adopted or implemented rotational grazing. But I say there's this question mark on the environment. So if we were going to achieve what was the buzzword at the time was sustainable intensification, we're going to produce more from less. We maybe had some methods that we could do it with, but we only had anecdotal evidence as to how those methods benefited the environment. And this started to become a challenge because as a member of the public looking in a field, what did they want to see? Did they want to see animals sort of spread out, maybe seeking shade under a tree in the corner, able to graze wherever they want all of the time? Were they happy to see animals confined into a paddock or a cell? We knew that rotational grazing management or techno-grazing management was better for profit and for output, but it did lead to some questions on animal welfare and maybe on environment as well. That many animals in one place, is that really a good thing? We saw in New Zealand that Hawke's Bay started to impose stocking rate limits on some of their farmers in certain catchment areas. And then all of a sudden we had the argument that, well, it's not how many cows, but it's how they're managed. Okay, well, where's your evidence to support that? And it was that need for evidence that led us to where we are now, really. there was a need for my business, for Precision Grazing, to be able to demonstrate, to be able to show our clients that what we were suggesting they do was right for their business, not just for profit and for enjoyment, but also for the environment and for the community. And also we want some data to help inform or influence policy making or policymakers around what direction the industry should take. So if rotational grazing or techno-grazing is the right decision for the industry to remain profitable and competitive and to reduce its inputs, can it also tick the boxes? Does it also tick the boxes for the environmental benefit? So that was some of the background to the project. There's my contact details in case there's not a chance to share them at the end. And I'm going to hand over to Sarah shortly, who will take you through the sort of ins and outs of the project. So with that brief, what do we put together? And now in its third year, what has that project achieved? What have we learned? Are we closer to be able to providing a model of sustainable intensification? And can we provide some direction to industry as to where people should be taking their farms? Before we do that, there's going to be a couple of polls, very short polls, which will get you to fill in, just to give us a better idea of who's in the audience, so we can sort of tailor some of our discussion and questions to you guys as we go through. So, yeah, Gareth, you could perhaps launch the polls, and I'll get set up to hand over to Sarah. Yeah, so if you guys can see the first poll. So the first one is just around what sort of stock you've got on the farm, and if you could select what stock class that's the largest or that's the main enterprise on the farm. And so the chat today is going to be mainly around beef, and obviously you've seen that from the first part of my discussion. The theory of what we're doing in terms of the grazing management, and also what we're recording in terms of data for the project, is relevant to all stock classes. And actually Rothamsted have got some excellent projects that are ongoing currently, which is specifically focused on sheep and sheep type systems. But the theory and background and some of the fundamentals are relevant to each. And should we change to the next poll, Gareth? Okay, well, we'll just do one. No, there we go. And then just gives us an idea of the sort of size or scale of your business. So the grazing platform, what size is your grazing platform? So that's the area of the farm that's currently in grass or currently in some sort of pasture. Cool. I think we can finish there. So I'll hand over to Sarah, and she'll take you through the project, what we recorded and how it's worked. And between us, we'll sort of chat through what's happened over the last 3 years. So over to you, Sarah.
Thank you very much. And thank you for your really good introduction and the background to Precision Grazing and the project. And as you've alluded to, it's quite an exciting time at the moment in terms of having the opportunity to influence policy, particularly now that we're going through Brexit and the government are forming their new agricultural bills. As you've highlighted, there's a lot of emphasis on becoming more efficient in terms of production output, but also safeguarding the environment. So yeah, this is quite a exciting time, sometimes worrying time, but exciting time to be in the space that we're in at the moment. So I'll just share my screen.
I think it's a really, really important time for farmers and for everyone to be pulling together to discover and to share the evidence that's available and to do this sort of research for the good of the industry, so the industry can go back to policy and say, hey, look, we've gone away and done this for ourselves. We've got the evidence. And sometimes I think in farming, we're very quick to complain. We're very slow to invest time and effort ourselves into producing this evidence. Hopefully this is what the project's hoping to do.
Hopefully. So can you see my screen okay?
Yeah, that's good, sir.
Yeah, okay. So I'll start by giving sort of a bit of a broader background in terms of grasslands in the UK. As you're probably aware, grasslands vary quite widely throughout the UK. So here we've got some examples of, as James has already been discussing, the more intensively managed grazing systems. Obviously, it's not just about grazing on a whole farm. You also make silage. You've got some farms that grow herbal lays and meadow fields. You've got upland areas, lowland areas. So it's quite a diverse mixture that's called, under grasslands. So we're quite lucky in the UK that around 65% of the UK is covered in grasslands. But as you've seen, it's quite variable as to what that actually means. And how this is managed also hugely varies. And that's due to differences in soil types, pasture composition, have you seen, weather patterns, whether you're sort of towards the north of the UK or the southern areas, the production methods, the types of livestock species and the breeds you have, topography and terrain, and the farm size and labour availability. So we're talking about quite a varied and diverse topic in terms of grasslands and grazing. And in terms of grazing management, there are a lot of different approaches and strategies to manage your grazing. So here are some of the more traditional grazing management systems that have been in place for a long time. So you have very sort of low input in terms of management systems, such as set stocking and continuous variable stocking. So you have fairly low to medium stocking rates with these systems, and it's very sort of put the cows out in the field and they'll get on with it. You also have some farms that run a rotational field system, so they'll put cows in one field for 3-4 weeks until they've eaten all the grass, and then they just move on to another field. And there's also strip grazing, which became popular in the dairy sector. I'll note that this strip grazing here is just a front fence strip grazing, so no back fence, so they've got access to the residual. And again, the reason for just doing a front fence was to keep labour inputs low. The advantages of these types of systems is that you need minimal infrastructure. Fields and hedges with fences are already there. The watering system is quite simple. You just have one water trough, and again, it requires fairly low labour input because you're not moving cows very often, just leaving them in the field to get on with it. As I say, it uses a low to medium stocking rate, but you've got no control over the grazing pressure. So they can quite easily start selectively grazing, and that won't help your the longevity of your pasture, especially if you put a new lay in. And the grazing areas get a very short or infrequent, or in the case of set stocking, no rest period during the grazing season. If we move on to more modern grazing management, which is seen sometimes as more intensive, you've got systems such as the hub and spoke system, where you subdivide fields, but you keep one common area of that field, usually where the water trough is, so that you don't have to worry too much about water to the animals. Paddock grazing systems, so you subdivide fields into smaller areas and rotationally graze these. And then that moves into sort of a mob stocking system, where you've got even smaller areas of land with higher stocking densities. And then we've also got the cell grazing, where you've got very small areas of land, and you can precisely calibrate how much land you allocate per day to how many cattle you've got and what the expected output of them are. So the positives of these types of grazing management is that they use very high stocking densities. You've got very good control of grazing pressure, which discourages selective grazing. And this is quite important when you're talking about herbal lays. because herbalays are quite sensitive to selective grazing. So it's more advantageous to use these types of systems on a herbal lay for that lay to prolong its diversity. And you've also got prolonged and adjustable rest periods depending on the time of year that you're grazing. However, some people are put off by these systems due to the additional requirement of infrastructure. Access to water is sometimes tricky, and also the higher labour input and management from moving the cattle on more often. So I've given you a sort of taster of the types of grazing management systems, and now we're going to hand over to you to find out what type of systems you currently run on your farms. So if Gareth, you could stick a poll up, please.
Okay, so it's good intro, Sarah. I guess what the paddock, cell, mob, and sort of hub and spoke grazing systems all have in common that differs to the first options you put up is that they, although they've got different names, fundamentally they're achieving the same thing, aren't they? They're achieving the animals are in a dedicated area for a short period of time, and then that area is left to rest and recover before it's then used again.
Yeah, these were the sort of the most common names I could find for these types of systems. But as you say, they all have a common theme underlying them. But I've also found that they're sometimes called management intensive grazing, high density, low frequency grazing, and lots of other words and names for them. But as you say, fundamentally, they've got the same underlying concept of you've got a large number of animals in a small area and you move it on frequently to allow that pasture to have some rest.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's holistic and regenerative grazing, so terms that have perhaps become more prevalent or widely used in the last 2 or 3 years. The fundamentals of those systems are still aiming to achieve the same thing, although sometimes they can differ in terms of target entry and exit heights, so how much pasture animals are going in, how much they're targeted with using, and then how much they're leaving behind. We'll touch on that perhaps as we go to the next part of your presentation.
Yeah. So the idea behind this approach is to mimic the behaviour of wild herbivores. So they sort of usually move around in large herds and they move to different pastures because they're, in the savannah, they're able to do so. So this kind of system is trying to replicate that natural behaviour of their animals, but in a controlled way that you can then increase your production.
And rather than predators, we've got electric fencing.
Yes, which most of the time have the same effect.
The same effect, yeah. It also bites.
Yeah. I'm sure me and you both know how often that happens.
Yeah, but because we recognise that species mainly grown in the main species grown in the UK perform or have higher productivity when they can be grazed and then left to rest and recover, and they also have better longevity in terms of maintaining species that were sown, as opposed to having those productive species sort of die out and then having aggressive weed species.
Yeah. Cool. I think we've probably had enough time for the poll, Gareth. Hopefully everyone's been paying attention.
Yeah, I think it's taken it off, Sarah, so you're good to go.
Okay. Right. So as James mentioned, the benefits of the improved grazing management, which have been shown in many different publications and in a UK context, is the economic benefits such as increased pasture production, better utilisation. You can extend the grazing season because you've got that flexibility in terms of your grazing and your rest periods. You use higher stocking rates, which in turn you can produce higher live weight gain per hectare, and that encompassed leads to increased profit margin. So as I say, there's quite a body of evidence out there to show that these more modern grazing systems achieve better economic performance. However, there's only anecdotal evidence for the environmental aspects. So in terms of when you're talking about these grazing management systems, you hear anecdotally that you can lower your inputs such as fertilizer, pesticides, etc. Quite a topical thing at the moment is sequestering carbon into soils and possibly creating carbon neutral or carbon negative production systems. So that's something that's gaining quite a lot of interest at the moment. You have improved nutrient density because you've got animals in small groups and they're moving fairly regularly. So they're not sort of dunging and urinating in one corner of the field and then grazing the rest. They're rotating around and that nutrients from the dung and urine also sort of move around the system with them. And you also get some improved biodiversity. As I say, there's little scientific evidence to support these claims, but at the moment, in terms of Brexit and the agricultural bill, this evidence needs to be produced and presented to the policymakers. I don't know if James, you've got anything to add there?
No, that was just actually went through my section. We had so much in agricultural press from businesses like my business. Lots of encouragement to this is the route that farming should head down. Livestock farmers should head in this direction. And from an economic point of view, it does make a lot of sense. The environmental side, one, it's hard to measure. Two, sometimes it's expensive. Three, we haven't got facilities on farm. And so what we have from the environmental side is lots of anecdotal evidence. But if it came to a regional council or a district council in the UK saying, well, we think for environmental benefit, every farm should be limited to a cow a hectare, where were we going to go to support that? We have lots of anecdotal evidence to say, no, it's how the animals are managed. It's not the number of animals, but how do you support it? And so that was really important. It was important when we started this in 2017. And it's interesting how quickly that's changed and how the carbon's become so much more important or so much more focused now than it was even just 2 or 3 years ago.
Yeah, and I felt that as well, is that the environmental side of production systems is becoming much more highlighted, and that's evidenced through the government with their 25-year environmental plan and the new ELM system coming through that will replace the single farm payment. So it's something that farmers and producers will have to think more about. So having that evidence is very important.
Yeah, which makes the results of what we find very exciting.
So as James mentioned at the end of his presentation, through discussions between Rothamsted and James, we formulated this study to look at the environmental impacts of contrasting grazing management systems. So in this experiment, we are comparing the set stocking system, which is sort of the traditional way of managing grazing animals, and comparing that with cell grazing, which is a much more modern, more management intensive grazing system, and focusing on the environmental impacts of these ways of managing grazing animals. And as I say, this is to fill a gap in the science, particularly in a UK context. There's not a lot being done in terms of the environmental impacts of grazing in the UK. So this is quite a pioneering study in that regard, and to look at the economic and environmental aspects of the system and how they balance, and to inform policy. So the project is a 3-year project, which began in April 2018. So we are now in our 3rd grazing season. The type of animals we're using are dairy cross beef steers, a range of different breeds. And this experiment was established on a pre-existing pasture. So that pasture was reseeded in 2013. So it's had a mix of silaging and grazing between 2013 and 2018. So it's quite a typical sort of perennial ryegrass white clover pasture that you'd find on a farm, and it's classed as a permanent pasture as it's more than 5 years old. The key thing with this study is that it's a replicated design, which strengthens the statistical analysis of the data. And this project is funded by Agri-Tech Cornwall, which Kirsty introduced at the start of this webinar. And the emphasis is working with Cornish and Isles of Scilly SMEs. For example, we're working with Precision Grazing, as well as delivering the scientific results. And we've also worked with some other SMEs in Cornwall, such as Berthsill, Glass Data, and Philip Warren. So the project's, although it's a scientific project, it's got quite a practical, applicable side to it as well, through working with these SMEs.
So it's been great that Cornwall, to have that support from Cornwall Agri-Tech for this type of project, because without their funding, this really wouldn't have been delivered. And there's a clear gap in the industry in terms of the funding for independent research into something that has a benefit for, is a benefit to the industry, but doesn't contain or is not associated with a particular seed or fertilizer or feed behind it. And a lot of research in industry is for those sorts of things. It's a new seed, it's a new feed, it's a new fertilizer, and the benefit to the farmer is not always clear, and certainly quite often the environmental benefits not even taken into account. So the Agri-Tech funding has been really fundamental to it. The choice of a dairy beef animal was in line with what we saw happening in the industry in terms of some of the integrated supply chains that were being set up between either retailers and processors to take those male cows from the dairy industry, as New Zealand had done for a number of years already, and to take them through to beef. It lined up with the desire from the retailers for a smaller carcass size, which the dairy beef animals could deliver on, and for a leaner carcass, which again they could deliver. The last point, I guess, is the fact we're using a permanent pasture. And I think we'll see, Sarah, how that permanent pasture is evolving under different management systems.
Yeah. So in terms of the data we're collecting, we're taking a whole system approach. So we're collecting data at the soil level, the pasture, the animal, and the product level. So it's quite a all-encompassing approach to this experiment. So this is a bird's eye view of the layout of the experiment. So the areas that are outlined in yellow are the set stocking paddocks, and they're 1.75 hectares in size. And the areas outlined in orange are the cell grazing areas, and these are 1 hectare in size. The reason for the difference in size between the set stocking paddocks and the cell grazing is that because it's already been shown that you can increase production per hectare on a cell grazing system, then we were fairly confident that we could put a smaller paddock size in for the cell grazing and produce the same or more live weight gain compared to the set stocking, and also just practicalities of fitting it in onto the allocated fields. So
let's keep the group size could be kept the same as well, couldn't it, Sarah?
Yes, yeah.
So a similar number of animals per group. Set stocking animals were at a lower stocking density, but the number of animals in that group could be the same.
Yeah, the same. So each of the systems are paired as well. So this takes into account the difference in topography across the field. So the field itself is quite a dome shape. So at the bottom towards the track is the lower end of the field, and then it goes up steeply to the top system. So because they're paired, we can also take environmental and topographical differences into account into the statistical design and take that variation out as well. So this is what that looks like in reality in the field. So on the left, we've got the set stocking animals, which are turned out to the 1.5 hectare plot, and they're left there to graze all season, basically until the weather conditions deteriorate to the point where they're not happy outside anymore, or more commonly they graze to below 2,000 kilograms dry matter per hectare. That's our minimum pasture requirement for the set stocking. And the stocking rate on the set stocking is fixed, so that means that the same number of animals stay on the plots for the duration of the grazing season. We don't have any change in the number of animals or the size of the paddock, so we don't temporarily fence off areas. So it's all just put the cows out and they do what they please. On the inset, I'm just showing the difference in the water system as well. So on the set stocking, they've just got a traditional concrete water trough, whereas on the cell grazing, which is on the right, you can see these are electric fenced into their lanes, and the area that they're allocated each day depends on the pasture cover, pasture quality, and the expected growth rate of the animals. So we calibrate that fairly tightly. We feed the animals to about 2.5 to 3% of their body weight to make sure they're getting a full belly. And in terms of the water system on that, we're using these micro troughs, which are very easy to move with the animals as they rotate around the system. On this system, we also use a variable stocking rate. So in times where we've got pasture surplus, we'll add animals into the system so that we can keep on top of the pasture. And on the flip side, if we've got a deficit of pasture, we'll take animals off. So it's quite tightly managed in terms of number of animals and pasture growth and utilisation. So as I said, this experiment started in 2018, which seemed like felt like a good idea at the time, but oh my God, talk about being thrown in the deep end. So we had a late wet spring in 2018, which meant that we had a delay in turning out the cattle. On the next slide, you'll see how much rain we had in March. So this meant that we were waiting for a long time for the ground conditions to be right, and also the grass to start growing, because it was knocked back a bit. And once that happened, the grass went crazy. And we actually didn't have enough stock at the time to keep on top of the grass. So we put them on a quicker rotation just to try and sort of maintain the grass, but we weren't hitting our residuals that we would have liked. So we had higher residuals, which you can see in the bottom right hand corner picture. And then,
by residuals, we mean how much grass is left behind after the grazing event.
Yeah. And then it stopped raining, which wasn't expected, especially in Devon. So as you can see in the graph, the darker blue bars are the total rainfall for 2018, and the turquoise bars are the historic average for Northwick. And as you can see, in March, we had about twice the amount of rain that we typically have at Northwick, hence why we had a delayed turnout. But come June, we actually only recorded 2.4 millimetres of rainfall for that month, which, yeah, it went from one extreme to the other very quickly. And as you can see from the pictures, the grass quickly sort of, died off.
Yeah, it's interesting. The soil type on the site's pretty character building, isn't it? In terms of it's a really heavy clay.
Yeah.
So when it's wet, it's completely almost bottomless, and then all of a sudden it becomes very dry and it's cracking, and all that moisture that it seemed to should have been holding, it's let go and it's disappeared. So we discovered in 2018 pretty quickly that this was going to be I certainly discovered it was going to be a much more challenging site to deal with than I expected, and how little resilience the site had, how it could go from being so wet we could barely travel with a quad bike in March, and 180 kilo cattle were making a mess, to just going bone dry within 3 months.
Yeah. I forgot to actually put a picture in to show that, which I captured at the start of this year, which within 2 weeks, it went from, as you say, difficult to drive an ATV on the field because it was that wet. 2 weeks later, it was dry and cracking. So it can change very quickly on these soil types. So yeah, as you say, we're on heavy clay soils, and it's been quite a learning curve of how to manage and deal with that and how quickly it can change.
Yeah.
So
I guess the thing to consider till we get onto the numbers is that what we're looking at here is the difference between the set stock and the techno cell grazing, and but the overall numbers obviously are very relevant to the site at Rothamsted.
yes, yeah, because it's got its own little microclimate sometimes. So thankfully, towards the end of 2018, it did start raining and things did start greening up again. Because of the surplus of pasture that we had at the spring, we managed to maintain the cattle on pasture throughout 2018, which was a lot different to other farms in the UK that had to offer supplementary feed, started opening their hay and silage earlier than expected, but we kept our cattle just on pasture. But that did mean that we had lower than expected growth rates from the cattle. But in hindsight, it was a good opportunity to test and the systems in terms of quite an atypical year, to see, you know, how being able to manage the cell grazing versus the set stocking, what you could do in a situation where your pasture was not growing.
Yeah, so what we found in 2018 is that cattle both systems survived. We managed to take the cell or the techno grazing animals through at a much higher stocking rates without putting in extra feed. So we achieved had a very low cost year, but performance was affected across both systems, wasn't it?
Yeah, which we will see later on.
Some resilience there, but with that resilience came a reduction in performance.
Yeah. So thankfully in 2019 things were back to normal. No drought in the middle. So these were the same cattle as in 2018. So I forgot to mention, in 2018 they were turned out as 6-month-old calves, and they grazed till sort of 12-13 months, and then they were housed over winter and then turned out for their second grazing season. So these are the same cohort.
And they had the same treatment in the winter, didn't they, Sarah?
Yes, yeah. So they were all on the same diet, which was mainly silage with about 1 kilo of concentrate a day, just to make up for that poorer performance during the first grazing season. And when they went out for their second grazing season, they went back out onto the same grazing treatments. So the techno animals stayed on the techno grazing and the set stocking stayed on the set stocking. And then we also took these cattle through to slaughter, which was one of the reasons why we needed to increase their live weight during the winter, so that we had a chance of slaughtering the animals off pasture. So 17 cattle were slaughtered directly from pasture in November, and these were used for meat quality comparison, because we are interested in the whole system, so that's from soil right through to product. So we wanted to see whether the difference in grazing management would have difference in the meat quality. And then in 2020, we got a new batch of calves. So these were 6-month-old calves again, which looked very promising. They're a nice bunch, and I was ready to have a third go at this system, but didn't expect a global pandemic to happen, which I'm sure no one expected, but it did have a bit of a effect on the experiment in terms of delaying the start of grazing. So in 2019, we turned the cell grazing animals out earlier because we were able to, but in 2020, because of COVID, all animals were eventually turned out onto the experimental paddocks at the same time, just because we had to put stuff in place for staffing and animal welfare. But due to the time critical nature of this experiment, there was a point where this might have been cancelled this year, but due to the time critical nature of the experiment, we managed to get special permission to continue collecting the core data for the experiment during lockdown and since. So thankfully, this experiment actually hasn't been affected as much as many other experiments I know have. So we've just about sailed through. And COVID aside, it's been a fairly good year for grazing. As you can see from these pictures, the pasture covers are very good, and they're leaving very good residuals as well. Quite pleased with the residuals. So yeah, it's been going okay.
And
the other
we've seen a change. Sorry.
The other positive about these cattle are that they're interested in the science as well.
And you can see from those pictures there's been a change in the site as well in terms of pasture composition and pasture growth rates as well, which has come through in some of the data being collected now.
Yeah, so it has, as you say, in this third grazing season, I can now visually see the differences between the systems. Both systems had quite a hard first year, and I think that set us back in terms of seeing the differences between the systems. And as you say, that difference is now starting to be captured in the data that we're collecting. So this is a few video clips that I've taken earlier this week. So this is how the systems are currently looking at the moment. On the right here, we've got a set stocking, and these here are the cell grazing animals. So as you can see, there's a fair amount of pasture ahead of them, and they're leaving pretty good residuals at the moment. This is another cell grazing group, which are at the top of that map that I showed you. So again, the covers ahead of them are holding out pretty well at the moment. But as James said earlier, it might be ground conditions that hold us back. And then on the right here, we've got the set stocking.
What's your rotation length at the moment, sir?
So they're on a 28-day rotation at the moment. And then depending on what the ground conditions look like in the next couple of weeks, I might have to reduce the stocking rate just so that they're not making such a mess. And then this is the third cell grazing group. And their set stocking counterparts. So it looks a lot different, the weather there to outside today, but
the visual difference in terms of just the dock population between the pastures has also become very evident as well now.
Yeah, so I try and keep any other management, so in terms of topping and stuff, to a minimum, just to try and reduce any of that extra variability. So these paddocks haven't been topped this year, so as you can see, the dock population between the systems is quite different now, and also the visually the clover content on the techno grazing systems is increasing, or has increased over the last 3 years. Whether we'll capture that in the botanical composition data I collect will depend whether that clover growth has happened in the specific areas that I do that botanical composition. But visually I can see that the clover is a lot higher in the techno grazing than the set stocking. And again, moving forward in subsequent years, that difference might become even more evident. It's just annoying that in the final year we're actually starting to see that divergence of the systems. But so moving on to a bit of the data that we've collected. On the left here, we've got the pasture cover between the systems. So this is our typical grass growth rate, at Northwick. In the dark blue is 2018, in the turquoise is 2019, and in the green is 2020. So both systems sort of react fairly similarly between the years, but we are starting to see that the cell grazing is maintaining a higher pasture cover through more pasture being grown. So that then is relating to the stocking rates that we're using, with cell grazing systems being able to accommodate a higher stocking rate compared to the set stocking, which has been previously shown and is something that we expected. So with cell grazing, we're up to about 2,000 kilograms live weight per hectare, whereas the set stocking averages about 1,500 per hectare. And then this is the pasture utilisation for 2020 up until the end of July. So the darker bars are the residual. So as James said earlier, that's the pasture that they leave behind them. So yesterday's pasture. And then the lighter blue bars are the entry cover. So that's what they're going into. And then the difference between the entry and the residual, you can work out your utilisation. So our average utilisation is about 70 to 80%, whereas it's been reported on set stocked farms utilisation is around 50%. Is that correct, James?
Yeah, it's textbook figure.
Yeah, so we're growing more grass and utilising more grass, which is good.
And it's probably also interesting to note the some people listening might be aware that within the industry is normally a target residual 1,500. So that's approximately 3.5 centimetres compressed grass height. In terms of that's grass left behind after grazing, whereas the nature of the pasture, in terms of the age of the sward and how it's previously managed, means that we've never been able to achieve that on this system. And so instead, we're running a higher residual, going into slightly higher covers, but maintaining the quality through the rotation length.
Yeah, and that is reflected in the live weight performance of the animals. So as mentioned in 2018, the live weight performance was a lot lower than expected due to the dry couple of months we experienced. So the set stocking was 0.48 kilos a day on average, whereas the cell grazing was 0.32. That is equivalent to 77 kilograms of gain per head on the set stocked and 48 on the cell grazing. But even in the drought year, we saw that the cell grazing produced more kilograms of live weight per hectare than the set stocking. In 2019, the live weight gain on the set stocking was higher per day than the cell grazing, but this was translated into a higher live weight gain per hectare on the cell grazing than the set stocking, which is something that we expected, as it's been shown previously, that you can increase your live weight gain per hectare. And then in 2020 to the end of September, the similar data to 2019 has been collected. So the daily live weight gain on cell grazing is slightly lower again, but the live weight gain per hectare is higher. So yeah, I don't know, James, if you want to add anything.
Yeah, there was frustration in year one where the live weight gain per hectare was so similar. There wasn't much of a difference with cell grazing and techno grazing. And from the work we'd done with clients in 2016, from what I see in New Zealand, and from what we'd done as a business in 2017, was disappointed that there wasn't more of a difference, and we just hadn't taken into account, or I hadn't taken into account how hard the cattle had been working to manage the pasture that we'd started with. So the fields that we started with, although Sarah had perhaps described were permanent pasture, ryegrass, clover, they were very, very poor examples of that as a thing. So by putting the animals through the cell grazing or techno grazing, we've been forcing them to not be selective and to eat everything. And that meant they had to deal with a lot of weed grasses and lots of weeds that really were working hard to tidy up. So we just simply hadn't, one, probably given them enough to eat because we're trying to get them to achieve a useful residual and to get the utilisation we needed. And then also the pasture quality was way back on where it could have been. And as we've seen in 2019, we started to see the benefit of that hard work in 2018. And now in 2020, we're sort of starting to really see the benefit of the hard work in the previous seasons, which has been good. Although the live weight per hectare seems to have reduced, Sarah, from where it was in July.
That'll be because the which one?
The 2020.
The cell grazing.
Yeah.
I'll have to check the data.
Yeah. Okay. I thought that was originally up over 1,000 kilos for the end of July.
I think it was about 500.
Okay. That might be what I remembered from the previous presentation.
So much data and so many numbers.
So yeah, so we're finally seeing, it's taken a while. It's taken longer than I expected to see the benefit come through, and I think we've seen this perhaps before with clients, but actually not to the same scale that we had in this experiment. So we always see when we move to a rotational grazing system, we're asking animals to be less selective or giving animals less opportunity to be selective. And the pasture we started with maybe is of poorer quality, then animals certainly are working harder in that initial period. And I saw that at home with the outdoor lambing ewe flock. The performance in the first couple of years was far less than we anticipated, and that's really quite a big knock, especially when you sort of put your neck on the line and made quite a big systems change. To not have that benefit come through straight away is a real disappointment, and can mean that sometimes you stop doing it.
Yeah. So this data is useful to show that it actually takes some time to get those benefits.
Yeah, that's it, and that's been really valuable to have. And another outcome of the project is to show people that this patience is needed, and also probably to plan for, be aware that impact could have. Although I would say that this site in particular, this has been the biggest knock I've ever seen with a system change, because of the pasture and land we were dealing with and the state it was in when we started this project. So on the plus side, it's meant that the project is, what we've achieved in terms of output per hectare has been really high and really good. There's a really big difference from year 1 to year 3 as part of the change in management.
Yeah. So if we move on to some of the environmental data that we've collected, we take some soil samples each spring before the cattle are turned out. There's not much difference in the soil pH. They're varied a bit from year to year, but from system to system, there's not been any difference. The soil organic matter has increased on both grazing management systems, but it has increased quicker on the cell grazing. As mentioned earlier, there's quite a bit of anecdotal evidence about increasing soil organic matter and particularly soil organic carbon on rotational systems, but not much scientific evidence. So this should hopefully fill that gap. It will be interesting to see the soil samples that we take next spring, just to confirm that this divergence between the systems is real, and that the 2020 samples weren't just a sort of misnomer. And then moving on to available phosphorus, it's been increasing on both systems. I will add, both systems have had the same fertilizer input every single year. So there's not been a difference in how much fertilizer has gone on to the set stocking versus the cell grazing. So any differences you see here have been driven through the grazing management and not because of fertilizer input differences. So the available phosphorus seems to be increasing more on the cell grazing versus the set stocking. But this difference is only just now emerging. So again, this will be confirmed hopefully by samples that we take next spring. And similarly with the available phosphorus, that's increased more on the cell grazing versus the set stocking, although set stocking managed to catch up with the cell grazing. But interestingly, we do have one of the 3 cell grazing paddocks that are now index 2- for potassium. So that kind of shows that there is an increasing quicker on the cell grazing. But again, this will be confirmed with soil samples next year. And then moving on, James mentioned earlier in his presentation about concerns with animal welfare in these types of systems, because the animals are confined to small areas, things to do with the behaviour when they're in such small areas versus in a field. And to look at that a bit, we've been monitoring their behaviour using pedometers. So these pedometers measure step count, lying time, and standing time. So in the graph that you can see on the screen, this is the number of steps per day over a 24-hour period. So I think these are the average steps during June 2019. So as you can see, the behaviour during the day between the systems is actually quite similar. The orange line is the set stocking and the blue line is the cell grazing. So that first increase in the number of steps, which coincides with a grazing bout, the reason the cell grazing ones are later is that they have to wait for someone to go and give them their breakfast, whereas the set stocking ones can go out and have their breakfast first thing. It's interesting that the cell grazing animals seem to have that later breakfast, let's say, but then they catch up by lunchtime with the set stocking animals. So they'll have another bout of grazing around 1 to 3 p.m. and then a big grazing bout during the evening, so about 6 to 8 p.m. And then the number of steps overall per day is lower on the cell grazing than the set stocking. But it's interesting to see that their diurnal behaviour is actually the same or very similar between the systems. And then something that we've recently put onto the experiments is sensors to measure water usage and water temperature. So you can see here that we've got water flow meters, and these work through a LoRa wireless network connection, so low power, long range sensors. So we've got flow meters to measure water use on each of the systems independently, and also water temperature sensors. You can see here underneath the micro trough, one's fitted in there, and that will measure the water temperature. Reason for including this is that we noticed during the dry period in 2018 that the water on the Techno grazing system was getting quite warm, just because the pipes were freshly laid over the ground, and the water was sitting in the pipes getting hot, and the cattle weren't drinking the water fast enough to flush cold water through. So the water was just sitting in the sun getting progressively hotter and hotter. So we're looking at the temperature in the micro troughs and the main troughs to see what difference there is. And then these are some early data from the quality of the carcass and the meat from the animals from the second grazing season. So you can see the age at slaughter was the same because the animals were very similar age at the start. The live weight was slightly more on the set stocked cattle than the cell grazing cattle. The carcass weights in turn were slightly higher for the set stock than the cell grazing, but the kill out percentage was very similar. Conformation was very similar because they were similar breed types, and fat class was slightly lower on the cell grazing, but not by much. So you've got a set stocked average fat class of 3 and cell grazing of 3L. I've done some meat texture analysis, so those data in this right hand graph. So there were it's a factorial design, so we've got the set stocked cattle versus the cell grazing cattle, and then we also imposed 2 aging or maturation techniques to the meat. So we had a 14-day aging of the meat, which is sort of conventional standard aging, and then we also imposed a 28-day dry aging of the meat. So you can see here that the meat from the set stocked animals was lower or more tender, than the cell grazing animals. But if you look at the numerical values on the y-axis, the set stocked animals were around 3 to 3.1 kilograms of force, whereas the cell grazing were about 3.3 kilograms of force. Although this is a statistical difference, the average consumer wouldn't be able to pick up this small difference, because this texture analysis was done using a texture analyzer machine. So in terms of the literature, anything that's under 4 kilograms of force is deemed as tender. So meat from both cell grazing and set stocked grazing systems, and whether it's 14-day or 28-day matured, is tender, or would be classed as tender to your average consumer. And I think just as reference, any meat that has got a hardness score of over, I think, 5.4 kilograms of force would be deemed as tough. So we're quite a way below that tender cutoff. And then following on from this, I'll do some nutritional analysis as well as some other data that we're collecting, which we've got a summary of here. So we'll be looking at soil compaction. We did some soil compaction measurement at the end of 2018, and we're doing that again at the end of this grazing season. So we're going to see how the soil compaction has changed over that period, and whether the grazing management has had an effect on how that's changed. As I mentioned earlier, I take some botanical composition data to look at how the composition of the pasture is changing. As I mentioned, visually, the cell grazing plots have more clover in them compared to the set stocked, and they also seem to have a higher proportion of perennial ryegrass now compared to the other weed species. The usual weed species we have on the system are Yorkshire fog. That's our main weed species. We've also got some timothy, a bit of annual grass, and things like marsh foxtail and other stuff. But Yorkshire fog is our main weed grass that we have an issue with, just because we're on heavy clay soils which are quite wet. I'm also looking at nutrient leaching through collecting groundwater samples. We've got some data coming through on pasture quality, soil nitrogen and carbon. I've got some more stuff to do with the behaviour data in terms of the pedometers, and I'm also going to do some nutritional analysis of the meat samples as well. So that's an overview of the project and some of the data that we've collected so far, with a lot more to come. So yeah, thank you for listening.
Cool. That was good. So I guess in terms of a sort of an overall conclusion, what we've learned to date is that to the consumer, there's no difference in in meat quality or meat texture between the cell grazed and the set stocked. And I'm not sure at this stage whether we have a reason as to why the cell grazed animals were slightly tougher than the set stocked, other than perhaps 2018, in that reduction in growth rate may have led to a bit more bristle being formed, that they paused or held at maintenance opposed to being able to grow through that period. But that hasn't adversely affected, from the consumer's point of view, the meat texture. So that's a bonus. And for the same inputs and for the same genetics, the cell grazing is achieving more output per hectare.
Yeah.
What we are seeing is a greater divergence in output between the set stocked and the cell grazing areas. So the difference of the systems and the output is growing further and further apart from each other. And I guess at this stage, we haven't quite seen the cell grazing system normalise yet as to where it's going to sit. Because at some point, we'll imagine it will normalise. But
yeah, it will plateau sometimes.
Yeah, I guess the thing to consider is as we drive that system seems to be getting better as not so clover's appearing, so that's providing a source of nitrogen, that's fueling more pasture growth, that's allowing better stocking rates to be maintained, that's putting more nutrients back in. And I guess the particular challenge of the site is working with the soil and how compact it can be and the difficulty with getting air into it and that's perhaps a challenge still to be overcome, where we're maybe starting to improve that cycle of sort of nitrogen fixing bacteria, and we're seeing P and K being more available. So there must be air must be getting into that soil profile now through probably the rooting action of the plants. So there's some really interesting stuff happening, but perhaps we're on the cusp of seeing where that's going to go now.
Yeah.
So we've had some really interesting questions put in our Q&A section. I've kind of grouped them together under some sort of headings. So first ones are really around welfare. As we mentioned, we were talking about the comparisons there. So the question is about, does the livestock have enough shelter in the fields with the electric fencings? And could hedgerows and trees be planted along those boundaries, or do they need to remain flexible?
100% scope for, and indeed in New Zealand and in the UK, we're seeing clients plant hedges or trees along those lane-based subdivisions, provide shelter and shade. And anecdotally, we'd expect productivity to increase with that because of the reduction in wind speed, so the increase in pasture growth and more nutrient availability. So yeah, that would be very desirable for the extensions to the project, is to include that as one of the variables.
And is there a difference in terms of behaviour in regards to the cattle in the set stocking versus the techno grazing, in them trying to seek shelter or wind protection? And do you think this poses any kind of animal welfare issues?
So in terms of the behaviour between the systems, because they're in such small grazing mobs in the cell grazing and the set stocking, they're quite comfortable as a mob. One of the things that we didn't foresee when we designed the experiment was there would actually be quite a lot of interaction between different mobs over the electric fences. So I do see that where the cell grazing animals are within their lane, that can sometimes have an influence on the animals in the set stocked areas, and they'll actually come and lie the other side of the fence to the cell grazing animals. Because there's only one system of the set stocked that is actually next to a hedgerow, then we can't really make that comparison as to whether there's a difference in them seeking out shade. I will say in that system though, that those cattle actually prefer to lay next to the electric fence side of that field and not the hedge area, because they're closer to their next door neighbours, and it's also slightly up a hill. And there's that old saying that cattle will actually lie at the top of a hill if given the chance, and that's very obvious with these systems, that all three systems on the set stocked actually lie at the top of the hill. Why? Who knows, but it happens.
They run away easier. So the next kind of grouping of questions is around performance and in infrastructure. So one of the questions is, does this only work in large open fields on large farms?
Sorry, the images I shared in my presentation of the farm I worked on in New Zealand, the scale of systems out there are pretty incredible, and they are able to be because they're not constrained with sort of hedges, roads, people, houses that we have over here. So yeah, large scale systems obviously function better in large fields. The principles of managed grazing systems, whether it's rotational, holistic, whatever name you choose to put to it, those principles will work anywhere regardless of scale, from 6 cows as we have in this experiment right up to 600 cows. So they're not dictated by scale of system or field size.
The other questions are, is there a trade-off between animal performance and their ability to selectively graze? Would think that the animals first go in, quantity allows them to maximise consumption, but as it approaches the time to move, their intake becomes constrained. So what happens to the overall performance of how can this best be managed?
Okay, so what we've seen in the experiment is the ability for animals to improve pasture composition and quality towards more productive, desirable species, but as a consequence on their performance. But we'd see that as a short-term effect, and for some people that they wouldn't see that effect at all if the pasture they started with was good quality. When we target animals to graze down to a set height to best manage the pasture species that are in the sward, so we go back to perhaps our textbook example within the industry, which is a ryegrass pasture, newly sown, to encourage productivity and to maintain quality. The guidance is to graze to 3.5 centimetres compressed height and then let it recover to around 15 centimetres compressed height. To get an animal to graze to 3.5 centimetres, you have compromised that animal's intake, but your output per hectare is optimised because you're producing pasture of the highest quality. There is therefore always a compromise between per hectare performance and per animal performance. And on each farm, with many of our clients, will classify each different type of stock as to whether they're a high priority or low priority stock. And the high priority stock will be able to graze to very high residuals, so they won't have to graze the pasture down very, very far. So they always are being fed ad lib, the best quality. Then we may have some secondary stock classes. So these might be cows and calves, they might be dry ewes or barren ewes, and then they're tasked with sort of tidying up the pasture, so being less selective. So that's one way of overcoming that awareness or that fact that, if you have a set residual and it's relatively low, you'll compromise animal intake, but your per hectare performance will be higher.
I'll add to that, that's quite an interesting question from a sort of scientific point of view as well. One of the issues with grazing animals is that it's very difficult to monitor their feed intake in the field while they're grazing. There's a lot of different methods that have kind of been developed that measure bite rate. So you've got microphones that you sometimes put next to the animals to measure their bite rate and stuff. But that's something that we would like to look at more in this system, is looking more at the grazing behaviour and how much their intake is at each of the grazing bouts during the day. But as I say, it's quite a challenging thing to do with grazing animals.
Okay, so linked to that, there was also some questions about, will higher clover content of the cell grazing affect animal performance as an unintended consequence?
Hopefully, yes. And hopefully it will, and it should do positively. So we see clover content in swards as providing two things. One is an increase in kilos of dry matter, so total feed produced per hectare. And the second one is an increase in pasture quality. So both of those would lead to better performance for the cell grazing. What can inhibit it is if we were applying high rates of nitrogen fertilizer to the sward, because nitrogen fertilizer applied at high rates means the clover no longer has a purpose or a place in the system. So what we may need to consider once clover got to a ratio of perhaps more than 10% by dry matter in the sward is we could actually reduce our nitrogen fertilizer, and that would, in terms of carbon footprint for the system, have a really big influence, a really big impact, really big positive impact. So if cell grazing, techno grazing is enabling clover to come back, then that would have a big rollover benefit, providing it came back to sufficient levels so we could reduce nitrogen fertilizer inputs.
And would you expect to see a bigger performance difference on reseeds?
Well, that's interesting. Maybe not in the first couple of years, do you think, Sarah? But the divergence of systems would be interesting, perhaps the other way. So both systems would start performing really, really good, but then the set stocked area with the new lay, we'd see it. Hopefully, we would see an ingress of weed species, so the quality of that lay and the persistency would decrease, whereas the whereas the cell grazing should maintain the productivity of that lay forever.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, where you'd have very similar performance at the start, because the composition of the new lay would be very similar. But as you say, as the set stocked animals are given freedom to selectively graze, and you'll have areas that are overgrazed and areas that are undergrazed, then the composition and the quality of the pasture will decrease, and that will eventually have a knock-on effect on the animal performance.
Actually, because the interesting point is the more diverse the new lay, so the wider the range of species that had been planted, the quicker that divergence would have happened. And you mentioned, Sarah, herbal lays, didn't you, Sarah, in terms of rotational grazing or managed grazing being really important for a herbal lay because of how those herbs like to be grazed or need to be grazed to ensure they can survive.
Yeah.
Okay, so there was also a question. I'm not sure if you're able to answer this one, but it links in with the herbal lays. So is there a database to link up herb-rich lay producers and farmers who want to add herb-rich cutting lays to their feed regime? I would point out at this juncture, as a promotion, we're also at Rothamsted and partnering with Duchy College as part of the Cornwall Agri-Tech project, doing a project on the toolkit for multi-species swards, where we're looking at putting together all the information around those into a web resource around those multi-species swards. We're also doing research, quite unique research on ensiling of swards, multi-species swards at Rothamsted. So we'll hopefully be having some more webinar events that will be promoting our TOMS project. But I don't know if you guys would like to add anything there around that being added into feed regimes and grazing management.
Seeing grazing of herbal lays becoming, I think actually within our farm discussion group, so average member has 16 hectares of herbal lays, up from around 4 hectares probably as little as 12 months ago. So certainly lots of herbal lays being established for grazing. In terms of the database, then no, that's perhaps an opportunity for the TOMS project to operate in.
Okay, so one for Sarah here. How is the grass growth rate measured?
Oh, so we measure the pasture cover weekly using a rising plate meter.
And that's on both?
On both set stocked and cell grazing. And that's per replicate plot as well. So they're all managed independently.
A question about the live weight performance. Looking at 2018 and 2019, it seems that the set stocking animals are turned over quicker. Does this come into a total year live weight gain per hectare, as this might present an opportunity to get another group into the field? So does that management technique allow for an even greater turnover of animals?
So at the moment, because we're constrained by the number of animals that we've got on the experiment, then they are managed as a group, but it would be interesting to have different stock classes and see how we could manage that in terms of having some that are in their second grazing season and some that are in their first. We haven't got the scope to do it in this experiment, but I don't know, James, if you've got some more to add in terms of sort of the commercial aspect of.
Yeah, the output per hectare was the total achieved for the year, wasn't it? So obviously the ability to sell some of the heavy animals first to free up more feed for the lighter animals is really important when thinking of this as a farm systems approach. And because of the experimental design, we sort of a little bit limited on being really flexible with stock sort of purchase and sale to suit pasture growth, which if we could do that, then we'd have a bit more advantage, a few more management tools up our sleeve. The figures you shared, Sarah, and I'd still like to go back and check the 2020 live weight gain, but the figures you shared were total kilos live weight produced in the season. So if an animal was sold early, then that just freed up feed for the rest of the animals in its cohort. And that was important for both systems as pasture growth slowed down. Yeah, that's the downside with sheep and beef farming, is that your animals get heavier, and as pasture growth slows at this time of the season, then it's being able to sell animals is a really important management tool to free up feed for the lighter animals. Just like if you're perhaps made silage, you can release silage ground back into the system, but I say because of the experimental nature of what we're doing, we don't have the sort of full suite of tools at our disposal to manage pasture in the autumn.
So we have a question here. Obviously, we've been talking about our dairy beef crosses that have been used here at the Northwick for our research project. But it's asking how these grazing systems could fit into the dairy industry.
Okay. So we're seeing many block calving dairy farms where they have access to land suitable for grazing and walking distance to the parlour. And many of those have already adopted rotational grazing systems. Perhaps the opportunity for them may lie in some of the results we're seeing around the soil indice improvement and the pasture growth improvement or pasture species improvement, and how that might fit with their system. We know that in terms of nature grazing system, the size of the herd means they're going to be operating on a sort of field basis or on a paddock basis, and the nature of the routine means they're probably going to be moving to a new paddock every 12 to 36 hours. So it supports what the dairy industry is already doing. It maybe gives some interesting evidence around the ability to improve soil organic matter and soil indices under a certain style of grazing management, which perhaps we haven't picked up on, haven't seen in the industry before. It further supports the ability or the opportunity for their dry stock management, so the management of their dairy replacements, in terms of the benefits that can come from having those on a grazing system, sort of whatever that looks like, but the benefits compared to set stocking. And that's quite often the downfall of the opportunity in some dairy businesses, is that the herd may be rotationally grazed, but the young stock, their replacements are just set stocked, and sometimes set stocked with concentrate. So here's some evidence to say that perhaps that concentrate feed wouldn't be needed if a rotational grazing system was set up.
Okay, so we're just going to move on to the kind of economics. So we've had a question of, are there any grants or loans, subsidies available to support farmers with the electric fencing and mobile water infrastructure investment?
So the Farm Innovation Grant Scheme was operating within England, and I believe due to start again shortly. Plate meters, so electronic plate meters for measuring pasture, and solar energizers were included. You had to submit a grant of a minimum claim, so you would have needed to add some other items to that grant for that to be valid. Otherwise, capital items. Some capital items such as water troughs and water pipe have been funded through mid-tier, and there's been some interesting options there, and hopefully will be in the future, around the establishment of herbal lays, which I know some clients have used to put in some key infrastructure along with some herbal lays. There's not anything specific for electric fencing, and in my view, there perhaps doesn't need to be, because the return on investment is so quick and so positive that it's one of the few things that perhaps the farm can genuinely justify investing in, because of the increase in productivity. The key for the farm is to work out when it needs to use it and how it's going to use it. So just growing more grass isn't necessarily positive for the farm. It needs to come with a reduction in inputs. So I'm going to start rotational grazing, and I'm going to aim to halve my nitrogen usage in the first year. And so that's a genuine target that could be achieved by using electric fencing and by putting in some water pipe and troughs. And so as long as the as long as the investment comes with a cost saving or a clear idea of how the opportunity is going to be used, then the return on investment happens very quickly.
And in the economic considerations, does that also include the cost of the infrastructure and the additional labour for moving the cattle with this management structure?
Yeah, so we are planning on doing an economic costing of these systems at some point. Because our systems are sort of a mini version, then we'd have to scale up the infrastructure costs and the time needed to move the cattle. But that is something that we're hoping to do by the end of the project.
Okay, and we've had quite a few questions, and I really like these delegates, of have we got an extension to the project for another 3 years, and are we able to secure some funding so that we can run this for a longer time period? From the point of Cornwall Agri-Tech, currently Cornwall Agri-Tech programme finishes in between March and June next year, and as this is EU funded, we're unaware at this point whether we will get any continuation funding, but just to let delegates know that we are within Rothamsted and our wider partnerships, we are looking at other opportunities so that we can progress this project over a longer period so that we can establish robust results. Anything to add?
Yeah, no, I think it's it's good, and it's really good and useful to gauge the interest from the industry and from farmers in this work, because the reason for doing the work was to help to provide the industry with the evidence it needed to to help, well, to inform policy, to demonstrate or to show, to prove that this is the right way for the industry to head. And if the industry knows it's heading in the right way, what that direction looks like, then people can hopefully sort of embrace and adopt these new skills and abilities that come with managing these systems, and to make the investment in the infrastructure they need to operate these systems. Without some sort of direction from some sort of policy direction, or without the evidence to stand up to various members of the public, then it becomes really hard for people to invest and to make system changes in the business, and businesses can sort of stagnate and become indecisive on where they're trying to take themselves. So it'd be interesting to hear if farmers and industry think this is relevant and valid and want to see it continued, then maybe the farmers industry, we need to look at funding it through some of the levy that's being paid, or through some of the other funds that are out there, to ensure this can continue and that we continue to operate this work for the benefit of the industry.
And the last part of that section is a kind of technical question of whether there are any apps that are useful for farmers to introducing this style of grazing currently, or is this going to be another stage to a project?
It's certainly something that as Precision Grazing, we're looking at doing. There's apps that help you on the side of it. So there's some mapping apps that can help you setting up your paddocks. But the best way to get into it is to go to a knowledge exchange meeting, the type that's run by HDB, or perhaps to think about joining a discussion group. And as Precision Grazing, we run a number of discussion groups both in England and Wales, and you can find out more details on our website. And the discussion groups probably do two things. They help provide the knowledge, but also they can provide confidence that comes from speaking to other farmers that have been on a similar journey. And we find that people that are in the discussion group very quickly make progress in their businesses from the access to information they get by chatting to other farmers that have been through a similar process.
So we've got a couple of questions on soils. So to what extent do you think soil testing, soil knowledge is a consideration to make this system as successful as it can be? And how do we best show the benefits of sequestration within soils?
So I think soil testing would be an important part of this system, so that if you've got increases in, say, your available phosphorus or potassium, you can then reduce the fertilizer input for that. And also in terms of the amount of pasture you're growing, if through the rotational grazing you're growing more pasture without needing more nitrogen, then you can reduce your inputs. So I think it's useful to know that information. In terms of carbon sequestration, it's quite a complex thing in terms of sort of the biology and the mechanics of it. And going forward, I'm not sure how farmers, because there's talk about sort of being paid for carbon sequestration, but there's still some debate at the moment around how that will be measured, because measuring soil organic carbon is quite a lengthy analysis process and quite an expensive one. So whether there's any sort of any other indicators we could use for carbon sequestration?
I think for myself, and what we will see with a longer term experiment is the difference in pasture productivity or pasture growth rates through various weather challenges, and whether the difference starts to divulge between the systems, where there's a genuine difference in levels of soil organic matter or soil organic carbon. So the biggest impact we can hope to have is availability of nutrients and moisture retention. And so we should be able to see that in terms of pasture productivity through periods of hardship, particularly through periods of dry weather. So if we had another 2018 next year, how would our pastures and how would our systems respond now organic matter levels have been increased? How we improve it? We're hoping to demonstrate the improved resilience, so we can go straight through a dry period and remain green and keep pasture growing, whilst everywhere else around us, all our neighbours have burnt up and started to feed. So I think if you can demonstrate that, then that's a difference, really tangible difference, a really visual difference that would get people to buy in and start to take notice.
Yeah, and also as another promotion of one of our projects, we also have the soil organic carbon project going on within Cornwall Agri-Tech between Duchy College and Rothamsted Research. And we are looking at kind of spatial and temporal data on carbon soil monitoring and sampling. And we'll also be having a webinar on that in the not too distant future. So the next one around soils was, has there been any aeration subsoiling, and have you noticed any difference in moisture retention between the two systems?
So since 2018, there's been no aeration or subsoiling of the ground. In terms of the moisture retention, last winter I did see that these techno-grazing paddocks seem to have a higher water retention than the set stocking. That's only observational. I haven't actually managed to capture that scientifically through the data. We are hoping to do some infiltration tests at the end of this grazing season, though, so that would start to open up, what has changed below ground on the techno-grazing versus the set stocking. And we're looking at hopefully doing some soil aggregate stability work as well. So watch this space.
So now we've got quite a few questions on sort of the environmental impacts. I know that we're running over time, but if we just go through these, more questions are being posted all the time. But what we will do is, as I said at the beginning, we will put together a Q&A document and circulate that so that everybody's question will be answered. But I would just run through a couple of these environmental based questions. So have we, in your experience on your own farm, James, and working with farmers, and even on the experiment as well, have we seen any noted any or observed biodiversity improvements?
I guess perhaps what we're seeing is a reduction of species in the pasture in terms of plant species, as the pasture tends towards more productive species that enjoy or thrive in a rotational grazing system. Against that, I guess we're seeing at times of the year the rotational graze systems having a greater variety and a higher average cover. So at times of the year where the set stocked areas may be completely bared off with very little grass and cover remaining. The rotationally grazed or technically grazed system has a variety of pasture heights because it's growing more grass, it's more productive, and it's being managed in a controlled way. So that's probably leading or can lead to increased biodiversity by providing ground cover for different insects and wildlife. In a system that's got perhaps a higher level of or higher amount of herbs, and those herbs are of the flowering type, then again that system that's under rotational grazing management or technical grazing management is allowing some of those herbs to flower before they're grazed, and again providing greater biodiversity or greater source of pollen for insects in that respect. So yeah, there's perhaps a loss of species, total number of species, but a retention of more productive species, and then options in terms of rotation length as to how to manage those with some of those species that might be flowering at different times of the year.
I would agree with James there in terms of although the species diversity of the pasture might be decreasing, the fact that there's rest periods within that rotational grazing, then that might harbour more insects and beetles, etc. And the other thing to note is also the biodiversity below ground and whether that has changed between the systems as well. So we're hoping to look at the microbial diversity of the soil between the systems this coming winter as well. So that will allude to whether there's some changes in terms of the bacteria and the fungal numbers within the soil, and how that may have driven these differences in the soil P&K.
What's also, I guess, really interesting to consider is that in year 3 now, with the difference between the systems, is it that in year 4 we could look at the technical grazing systems and say, okay, well look, with the level of output we're achieving now per hectare, we can afford to drop off the less productive part of this system and return it or use it for environmental benefit. So because the areas we're dealing with, we've got 1 hectare for the techno and we have 1.5 or 1.75 hectares for the set stocking. So the techno is using up less land to produce you can produce the same amount of food from less area. So the area that's spared, what could we do with that to deliver an even bigger environmental benefit?
And the next one, I'm going to kind of combine 2 questions, is really about is there interest here from sort of wider stakeholders, and particularly in sort of wider catchment areas? So as you apply less chemical inputs using this system, then generally speaking, is it fair to say that techno cell grazing will result in reduced inputs? And are these sort of water companies, wider stakeholders, therefore growing in interest about reducing chemical inputs in watercourses and supplies? And are they interested in therefore supporting farmer trials and farmers to implement systems like this for greater benefits?
Definitely good. Definitely lots of interest from various stakeholder groups, particularly around the water boards. They've also shown interest in herbal lays because the ability of certain plants there to lock up or store nitrogen or nitrates and stop leaching. So there is, and I think it's perhaps interesting to note, I see a comment in the chat there, Kirsty, that of all the people on the call, only 21% were farmers. So there's a lot of industry interested. Well, there's a lot of industry inside today because it's wet weather.
So I have got the groundwater samples that I've been taking from this experiment. I'm waiting for the results, the full set of results to come through on that, but that might be a start to engage with these water companies of what the difference the grazing management is doing to that nutrient leaching.
And the ability to evenly distribute the animal nutrients on the technical grazing area by sort of encouraging or enabling the animals to lie in every part of the field really does avoid that sort of build up of nutrients. And so if we add that to the ability or the thought process that because we reduce the same from less land, we could spare the land that wasn't suitable for grazing, or we could include buffer strips within the grazing area, we could plant across the slope and put in these hedgerows or trees to further improve this. It also gives us much more opportunity for mitigation measures, but still maintain the output of the farm, which is, I think, is a perfect scenario.
Okay, as I said, we have run over time, but it was really interesting. We will be sending out a follow-up email to all the delegates and a feedback opportunity, and the recording will be available. And as I said, we will put together a Q&A document to accompany that recording as well. So I would like to just do a couple of thank yous. Thank you to Sophie Rapson and Gareth Lawless for their invaluable help behind the scenes. Nobody has seen them today, but they are there. And to our two presenters, James Daniels and Sarah Morgan. And thank you to all our delegates for attending, and we hope we see you all at future webinars soon.
Thank you, Kirsty, for setting up, and big thanks to Agri-Tech Cornwall for supporting the project and enabling us to do this research.
Thanks all.
Right, thanks, guys.
Good evening, everyone. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye.